Good morning and welcome, everybody. I hope you're well. I'm just going to do a very quick sound check to make sure that everybody can hear me. So if you'll just give me one moment. Brilliant. So it turns out we can hear me, so that's great. So welcome, everybody. My name is James Adams. I'm the head of research at Boring Money. Thank you ever so much for joining us today for our third Keep Calm and Carry On webinar. And today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about customer segmentation. And the focus today is very much going to be on the fact that we're aware that lots of you are making a reassessment of how you're going to handle the rest of this year, beginning to reforecast, to replan, to think about how you're going to tackle the issues that you're facing over the next year. And I always think it's a good idea to do that with the benefit of data. I had an old boss who used to say that if you think informed decisions are expensive, you should try uninformed decisions. So hopefully I'll give you a sense of how we approach those problems here at Boring Money and give you a few examples of some interesting information that we think we've gathered recently. So thank you ever so much for coming along, and I'm going to click on if that's okay. So today, just thinking about what sources I'm going to be using for this, where we're drawing this information from. The primary source I'm using for some of the segmentation I'm going to be doing today is the large nationally representative survey that we did of 6,500 UK adults, nationally representative UK adults that we did in the end of January. We also augmented that because January now feels oddly like a strangely long time ago, really, with a shorter survey of a narrower audience. So this is a survey of our panel of Boring Money readers, and we did 606 of those after the market had fallen significantly at the end of March. So we did a survey of them and how they were responding to that. So that's a survey of investors. And we also did simultaneously, as part of our kind of regularly quarterly catch-up, a survey of 2,000 fund investors. So that's an even narrower audience. That's an even smaller audience. So people who are fund holders and aware that they are. And that's something that we do every quarter. And that's primarily to look at fund value and measure that. And that survey also went out at the end of March. Lots of the information that we gather, the survey information, but also other information that we get from providers and other sources is housed on our data portal. So I'll also be using the data portal as I go through a little bit to illustrate how you might go and find this information yourself if you had access to that portal. So just also as a note before I go forward, there are some questions below. So if you scroll down, there's a place you can put your questions. If I have time at the end, I'll try and answer some of those questions, but also we can come back to you later with some of those. If you want to challenge me with your questions, those can be placed at the bottom. There's also some polls and other stuff you can interact with there, which is hopefully that's useful and interesting for you as well. The other thing to mention just before I go forward, I think, is I'm going to be a little bit more obscure, a little bit more imprecise than I would normally. So if this was we're obviously doing this as a free webinar. These are reports that other people have already paid for and other people will pay for, hopefully. And therefore, if I talked about things as a third rather than 33.2%, I hope you'll excuse me. We're going to be a little bit more obscure than I probably normally would in these circumstances. So just thinking about the ways in which people might use data, might use customer data in the context of investment, I've identified here three main needs, and this is how we structure our data portal. Our data portal is a relatively new product. We did launch it at the end of last year. We're actually going to kind of version 0.2, as it were, of that data portal very shortly. I'm going to restructure around these three main questions, which are three main uses, as I should say, that you might put this kind of data to. So the first of these is kind of you're writing a business plan. You want to know how many people there are, and I'm going to focus very much on that kind of question today, because we're thinking here about reforecasting and replanning, and therefore that's the kind of question I'm going to focus on. So those kind of market data questions: how big is the market, where are the opportunities? There's then within that, and I'll touch on this as well today, but to a slightly lesser extent, data on how people feel. So you've identified that segment. There are a million of those people, but what do they think? What are they interested in? What's their attitude to investing? So how do you target those segments? And then finally, the other type of data, which I won't really be talking about at all today, is data on actual providers, competitor information. So what do people think of my competitors relative to me? What market share do they have? Who's heard of them? Who's heard of me, etc. Those types of questions. So moving on, so getting on quickly to the type of data we might talk about, that I'm going to talk about today. So what I'm going to do today, we're going to look at some examples of how data might help you to replan and reforecast. So I'm going to start by looking at the UK investing market overall, giving some examples of how you might begin to chomp down UK adults into manageable chunks. And what are they like? What are investors do they like, and what are potential investors like? At a very basic, at a very high level. I'm then going to talk a little bit more about, so that was a survey we did in January, how have the attitudes of investors changed in response to recent events, so some more recent survey data. I'm then going to talk a bit about some more niche areas of segmentation. So I'm going to talk about one opportunity area, which is women savers. And I'm going to talk about one area where you've got existing customers who have a set of challenges that need addressing, which are people who are coming up to retirement at this moment. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might be able to help with some of these challenges. So if that's all fine, if that's all clear, I'm going to move on. So I'm going to start by thinking about who are retail investors and who aren't they. So who are savers, who are investors, what do they look like? So thinking about current retail investors, so these constitute about 27% of UK adults. So when we talk about current investors here, we're thinking about people who hold one of the products we consider qualifying to be an investor. So that's a personal pension or SIP, a stocks and shares ISA, or a general investing account. So we wouldn't include people here who just hold workplace pensions, or who hold pensions that they generated through a workplace that they haven't really interacted with since. So we're talking about people who are active or really semi-active investors. They hold an investment product and they know something about it. About a quarter of the people who hold investment products have already retired, and their average age is about 55. So to give you some context, the average age of a UK adult is much closer to 40. So they're quite a lot older, as you might expect, and a high proportion of them already in essentially in drawdown or have retired. So even within this group, so obviously they're a relatively informed group by the very fact that they're able to answer questions about investment. You know, we're getting at this group by asking these questions at the end of January. About 2 in 5 of them couldn't really tell us what their investments were invested in. So we asked them, we gave them some options: funds, investment trusts, ETFs, stocks and shares. People picked from those, but about 2 in 5 people didn't pick anything or couldn't select anything. They just didn't know it's an investment, but they don't really, those titles, those relatively simple high-level categories didn't mean anything. One interesting thing about this group is they're much less likely to ask family and friends about money matters. So we asked a question about who you would go to, how you would get information about your personal finances, and they're much less likely. Family and friends are a very high likelihood category for most other people, but for this group, they're much less likely to cite this group. Part of that, of course, might be that investors are, as I perhaps cited, a slightly unusual group. They're not the most common group in society, and these are perhaps the people other people go to for investment advice. I remember asking an investor I was doing a face-to-face interview with recently about whether they asked their family and friends for investment advice, and they said, well, not really. Actually, they don't tend to know anything. Actually, people, if anything, people ask me. But also, they might be more private about their money. There's something else, there's some other stuff going on here. They're actually much more likely than other UK adults, to go online for financial advice. And I'll talk a bit more about where those sources of information might be when I come on to talk about those people approaching retirement a little bit later on. They're a bit richer than the average UK adult in terms of income. Non-retired UK investors, about 40% of them have incomes of more than £50,000, household incomes, that is. Only about a quarter of UK adults overall have household incomes in excess of £50,000. So that's current investors. What do they look like? At a very basic level, who are those people? But thinking then about the potential investors. So when we say potential investors, I mean everyone who isn't currently an investor. And then what I've done here is a very simple segmentation to begin to address who a target group might be, who might be a target group to who aren't investing and who one might go after. And I've started by doing a very simple 2x2. I used to be a management consultant, and I can't quite get away from the 2x2s. I do love them. So looking at my 2x2 here, you can see that on the left, I've designated the non-savers, so people who don't currently hold any kind of saving product. And then on the right, the savers, so that's people who do hold a savings product. And then what I've done on the up and down axis is divided them into the people who said they would consider investing and people who said they wouldn't. Now, people who said they wouldn't consider investing aren't necessarily completely non-addressable, and people without savings aren't as well. And we can see that 12% of the UK adults who don't hold, who are in this broader group, who are people who don't save but would consider investing. So they're not completely unaddressable. But obviously, the most likely group of people who already have some money put away, right? So, and 26% of this group fall into that category. So what I'm going to do now is draw into that group. So that light green group, I've taken them over here, and you'll notice that I'm not telling you exactly how many are in these different buckets, but obviously some of these people are already retired. So I'm saying, well, okay, for the moment, let's not focus on them. So they could invest, but they're already drawing down on their pensions. So let's not focus on them as an opportunity area. And obviously, you've got a group of people who have savings, but those savings aren't very high. So a very high proportion of people don't have very high savings balances. And when I say the middle line here, I've actually put in at the 10K point. So you've got about 10,000. That's £10,000 in some kind of savings product already. And that's an arbitrary line. I could have drawn it in a variety of other places, and I could also have been a bit more sophisticated and relativized that line to income. But for this exercise, we're keeping it quite simple. I've just put it at £10,000. That's about that would be about 3 months. That's easily more than 3 months' income for most UK households. So that's why I got that 10K limit there. And when we look into that group, we're looking at 21% of that 26%, and that's about 3%, just over 3% actually of UK adults. And combined, that adds up to a pot of about 60 billion in savings. In savings. Obviously, that may involve making some assumptions about where exactly people sit on the distribution. I've been a bit conservative there. It could be quite a bit higher, depending on how you would tweak the assumptions for that model. So now I'm going to talk about that dark green group. So my target group, who are people who are non-retired savers who have something reasonable in assets that they could potentially invest. So that's about 1.7 million UK adults, that target group. This group is quite a lot younger than the existing investors. They're about 40 on average. They're still relatively wealthy because obviously they do have that substantial savings pot. Actually, about 47% of them, so actually they're a bit wealthier in income terms than the existing investors, have an income of 50K or more. They're much, much more likely, however, to be the kind of people who would ask family and friends for advice about personal finance. So we saw that existing investors are quite unlikely relative to the general population. These people are actually more likely than the average person to ask family and friends for advice. And they're even more likely to use online sources than current investors are. So that's partly, of course, because they're just more likely to say everything. They're people who are actively seeking information on finances. And that's partly to do with the fact that obviously we said they're people who will be willing to invest. So they're people who are thinking actively about their money, even if they haven't necessarily taken the leap to investing yet. So they're seeking information actively. But as I say, they're much more likely to be comfortable asking friends or family for advice than an existing investor would. One other interesting thing that I picked out about them, and obviously we could pick a wide variety of things, but one interesting thing that I picked out about them is that they're much more likely to say that the statement invest in a portfolio of mainstream shares with zero exposure to tobacco, fossil fuels, or weapons was likely to appeal to them than either existing investors or other non-investors were. This was a statement that stood out to that group. So that kind of ESG messaging does seem to resonate more with this target group than it does with other types of people. Obviously, one could drill into a variety of messages there, but I've just picked out that one example. And then finally, on this group, here's just an example of what it might look like if we were doing it in the data portal. So you can see, and I've just picked out personal income and household income distribution here. And we've got the filters here, and I don't think you can see actually where I'm pointing here, but on the right-hand side, you can see the filters you might use to adjust the household income groups, just look at men or women, look at specific age groups. I've already filtered the employment status at the top here to remove retired people. And I've also made sure that they're just cash savers. So they're people who don't hold investments, but do hold cash savings. So that's just an example of the data portal. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about current retail investors and where they are at the moment. So you can see the current retail investors. I'm sure they're not quite smiling quite as happily at the moment on their bed of money as they were probably at the beginning of the year, but these are people who do have existing retail investments. So this is a survey that we did of boring money readers, and what I've done here is just segment out some of the attitudes just by age, just as a very simple example of how the attitudes might differ across different groups. Broadly speaking, the consensus was at this point that things might get a bit worse for the UK economy, but actually older investors tended to be a bit more optimistic. And this, I think, is related to something else that we found about them, which is that they were more likely to say they'd seen this kind of thing before. They were more likely to think, so they're much more likely to say things are going to improve or stay the same, much less likely to see this as a cliff where you're just going to keep falling away. And actually, they've been proved right to a certain extent, obviously, since this point. We actually asked this very much at the absolute bottom of the market. Obviously, things have improved very slightly in terms, at least purely of FTSE 100 performance since we asked these questions. And moving on then to what people would do. So despite the fact that actually people were generally pessimistic about the UK economy this year, the majority of investors saw this as a buying opportunity, or rather a plurality of investors saw it as a buying opportunity, particularly those younger investors. And of course, this is despite the fact that they were more pessimistic. Of course, they've got a longer time frame in mind. So this just shows that the investors, at least the ones who read boring money, are taking a relatively rational approach. Older investors, less likely to make changes because they're much more likely to be retired, approaching retirement. They've got different types of consideration. Younger investors, more likely to make changes. And those changes are much more likely to be buying trackers in their case. They're a bit less likely to be considering specific stocks. Probably that lack of confidence and experience, perhaps lack of time, frankly, to spend time picking stocks means they're a bit more likely to pick something very general. So that's interesting. Just some interesting, very basic segmentation on how people are responding to this challenge and how people might be thinking about these questions. So now I'm going to move on and drill down into a specific segment, a segment of savers. This is female savers. This is something that the prospects, the way the industry caters for women, to bring women into investing, is obviously a topic that Boring Money talks about quite a lot. And so that's why I've picked this segment to talk about today. So what I've chosen to show you here on this slide is the difference between male and female holdings or stated holdings for various types of investment products. So women are a bit more likely to save and a lot less likely to invest is the overall message here. So if you look at the bottom two dark blue bars, this is the percentage point difference between men and women holding any investment product. So essentially there are 9 points of difference between the number of men who hold an investment product and the number of women. And for cash savings, it's actually in the opposite direction. Women are more likely to have a cash savings product than men, nearly by 2 percentage points, not quite, but about 1.5 percentage points more likely. And that difference for investment products is driven by all types of investment product. But interestingly, it's primarily, or one of the main drivers is stocks and shares ISAs. The personal pensions bar can be partly explained by the fact that women are more likely to work in the public sector proportionately. So they're actually more likely to have a DB pension than men are. So they're more likely to have a defined benefit pension because they're more likely to be public sector workers. But you can see that actually one of the main drivers of the big difference is not that, which is a very explicable difference, but actually the difference in holding stocks and shares ISAs. So they're much less likely to have made the transition from holding a cash ISA into holding a stocks and shares ISA than men are. And that represents, obviously, an opportunity area for the investment industry. So there's a group of people here who could invest and who have the cash to invest, but haven't yet made that leap into buying stocks and shares ISA. And this I felt was particularly interesting. So here, moving on to think about why that might be. So there are lots of drivers for that gap, and we could talk. I won't talk for a very long time about what all of those drivers are. But it's interesting to talk about some of those drivers are to do with having sufficient savings, feeling like you have sufficient income. Women are more likely to be single parents, and therefore have all kinds of other drivers. But actually, if we just strip down to those savers, so people who've already got savings and people who already have 100K in savings, it's interesting that as that asset value rises, so I've looked here at the dark blue bar versus that kind of turquoise bar. The turquoise bar is people who have less than 10K in savings, and the other group is people who have more than 10K in savings, and they're both savers. So these people, all these people already have savings, and you can see that the difference between men and women exacerbates as you go up the asset group. And of course, more people, as people get more assets, they're more willing still to consider investing, and both men and women are more willing. But that rise is much faster for men than it is for women, and that's why you see that minus 10 points difference in people saying yes versus only a minus 5-point difference for the group who have less savings. So as people get more money in their savings account, that gap in willingness really expands. So you see that men and women, that gap really grows with assets. So it's clear that whatever messaging that can target those groups isn't doing a sufficient job to overcome people's concerns or women's concerns, and they're moving further away from men as assets expand. So drilling a bit more into why that is. So here, this is a question we asked people who said they wouldn't consider investing, and we asked them which of the following reasons, or any of the following reasons. They could pick 3. So which of these reasons might you choose as reasons why you wouldn't consider investing? And here we're looking just at people who already have more than 10K in savings. So I'm trying to exclude just not having any money at all. So these are all people who have savings accounts and they all hold more than 10K, and looking at men and women. And what I thought was really interesting about this is actually the bar that's the lowest bar for men. So the very top bar there. But it's actually not the lowest bar for women. And actually, it's one of the ones where the gap between men and women is the largest, is not knowing where to go for information about investing. Men feel quite well served by the information that they get about investing. Women clearly don't to the same extent. And that points to an information gap, and it points to an opportunity, because that's a problem you can solve. Not having enough money is not a problem you can solve as someone who's marketing to this group, but having sufficient information is a problem that you can solve. Going down, however, to some of the main reasons that people consider, so looking at the bottom of the chart here, the largest, most selected options for men and for women, having easy access to money and being concerned about loss, risk-related topics are really the key reasons why people don't want to consider investing. They remain those. It's interesting, of course, also that the other thing that I thought was interesting about this is the contrast between the information answer and the answer about investing doesn't interest me. It's interesting that more men said that was a problem for them than women. Actually, it's not necessarily an interest gap. It is perhaps more information gap. And thinking about risk and loss, it's that concerns about how the industry communicates about risk and communicates about loss seems really critical to why this group of women savers who have more than 10K in savings wouldn't consider investing. So moving on, and I'm aware actually that I've taken quite a lot of time over this slide, so I'm going to move on a bit more quickly now. But this is another slide from our data portal where you can begin to see how you might have done the same segmentation. And this is a slightly different question about investing, but you can still see that risk is a really key phrase that female investors associate with, female savers, I should say, associate with investing. But I'm now going to talk about a little bit about the group who are approaching retirement. So about 5% of UK adults are currently are investors. They're over 55 and they've not yet retired. So that's about 3 million UK adults. About 60% of these hold a personal pension or SIP. About half have a stocks and shares ISA. About a third have an income of more than 50K, or live in a household that has an income, sorry, I should say, of more than 50K. And less than a third currently use a financial advisor. So that's about the same number of investors as investors in the general population who use an advisor. And if we look at their level of engagement with their savings, so you might have expected, and I expected when I looked at this data, perhaps to see them checking their account a bit more often than other investors, or doing other account actions a bit more often. But actually, they've done it about the same amount. So about half of them have performed some kind of investment account action in the last year. So they've checked their account, they've made a trade, they've done something. And that's actually about the same level of engagement we see for other investors. So investors who've already retired or investors who are under 55. So this group have some interesting decisions to make right now. They're a group who are probably most exposed as investors to the recent falls in global markets. So they're facing some interesting challenges. So I think one of the things that I thought was interesting is to think about where they would go for advice. Now, if they have an advisor, unsurprisingly, they overwhelmingly say that that's where they would go. There is a 10% who don't say they would go to their advisor, interestingly, but overwhelmingly they say that their advisor is where they would go for this advice. It's so interesting then to look at the non-advised group, and actually the top choice for this group, 49% said they would go online for advice, and that's an agglomeration of different sources, different online options that we gave them. And the top choice, actually, once you strip those out, is 35 saying they would go to a consumer finance website, which obviously we think is particularly interesting as we have a consumer finance website. But 35% of people said that. So they're looking for information online. The next two most popular choices for that group were a financial advisor and their common retail bank, but those both got under 35%. So those are both options that were less popular than just going to consumer finance websites. Other consumer finance websites are available, as we've illustrated on the right of this diagram. So again, here what I've done is pick out those investors in the data portal. And here what we've talked about is their relative confidence. So it's interesting to observe, and I'm not going to dwell on this slide partly for the sake of time, but it's interesting to observe their relative lack of confidence. So these are all people who already hold an investor. So I've selected them as investors. You can just about probably see in the diagram up here. They're non-retired investors. They're over 55. And there's still people who don't necessarily feel a huge amount of confidence, and still large groups who are in this kind of this kind of medium blue color who have quite low confidence. So I'm now going to talk a little bit, just in the last couple of minutes, about how we can help, and I'm going to try and answer some of your questions. So borrowing money has a variety of ways that we can help with some of the challenges you might be facing as you're trying to replan to address the needs of some of these segments. One thing we can do, as I hope we've illustrated in a very basic way here, but in a much more sophisticated way, is size specific segments of the market and talk about how big those are, what size of financial opportunity they represent. We can help understand what the attitudes of those segments are for you. As I hope we've illustrated, we already have quite a lot of survey data that's already on hand that we can use to help illustrate those questions. One thing we also do that I certainly don't do, and these pictures and the images that we've created here for this survey today are very much done by our marketing team, is help create content for your websites that people might be looking for. And hopefully what we've also illustrated here is the kind of needs people might have, and the fact that people are seeking information online about how to handle current situations, current investment questions. And also, finally, if you want to go and play with this yourself, you want to take a more DIY attitude, you can get access to the data portal and produce your own analysis. And that data portal provides you with up-to-date information, both from our site, from the regular surveys that we do, and information from providers that help you to provide a kind of comprehensive picture on the demographics, the behaviors, and something that you can do for yourself and you can play with in your own time, if that's the kind of thing that you like to do. It's certainly the kind of thing I like to do, obviously. So finally, in the last minute, and I realize we've hit time, so actually I'm just going to say, sorry, one other thing we can do. Obviously, this is all impersonal number stuff. If you'd rather hear the direct voice of the customer, that's something else that we like to try and provide for people. One way that you can do that is by doing online focus groups and online surveys. We'd like to stress, I think, that people are sitting at home now. It's actually quite a good time to go and talk to a bunch of consumers. People have little to do. It's quite a good time to get really good answers from people about their personal finances and to do those more in-depth kind of studies that perhaps the numbers stuff that I've been talking about more today doesn't. So if the numbers stuff doesn't float your boat, we can also help you with this, and there are lots of opportunities to try and do that. So finally, I'm going to move on to some questions. This is a picture of me on a Champion of Champions edition of University Challenge. I'm afraid to say that our score didn't get a lot higher than the 0 that you can see right there. It was an example, afraid of where This is a rather painful memory for me. I wouldn't have selected this photo myself. That was a crushing defeat to Manchester University. But hopefully you can answer me some questions now that I'll be better positioned to answer than I was when I did that show, my returning appearance on the University Challenge a few years ago. So one of the questions that someone has posted here is about how sentiment has changed since January. I think I've already talked a little bit about that. It was interesting to see that actually existing investors are probably a bit sanguine about some of this stuff, and be interesting to see when we do other surveys how regular savers' attitudes have changed. But we have obviously seen a bit of a surge in account opening, actually, and a bit of a surge in activity on DIY platforms. So I think people are trying to push that stuff up. And someone's asked percentage of this group. So Andy has asked what percentage of this group are more likely to want ESG than average. I can come back to Andy with this precise answer on that. I'm afraid I don't know the number off my head, but I can probably come back to you personally with a response on when I've looked it up exactly how much more. I'd just like to finish now. Actually, we've run out of time, and I appreciate that you all have other things to do. So thank you ever so much for attending today. If you would like to challenge Jim and ask your segmentation questions to me, please do come back either in the comments or feel free to email me or respond with the questions here to pose some questions to me. But in the meantime, thank you ever so much for your time, and I hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you very much.